Hi, everybody.
Hi.
So first of all, I'd like to thank Psychedelic STL and Mike Berger for the invitation to speak. Happened a couple of months ago. Phone number I didn't recognize. I don't normally answer those, but had the vibe to pick it up, and I'm like, hello, and he's like, John, it's Mike. And I'm like, Mike who? And he's like, Mike Berger. And I said, from? And he goes, oh, I said, oh, Mike, what's going on? He goes, would you like to speak on psychedelics and fragrance? And I said, absolutely. So that is what we're going to be doing tonight. I'd also like to introduce two people in the room that are going to be facilitating an experiential part of what we're going to be doing. So we have Darius Davis. There you go. Thank you very much. And we have Autumn Sheffield. And so these are two friends of mine and also senior students in the way of Incense. As some of you know, I am a Japanese komoto, which means just think of this like a tea master, but for the Japanese incense ceremony. Think of it as a sommelier, but for the Japanese incense ceremony, which is only about 1,500 years old. So just a short amount of time in our human history. But what we're going to do to start is that Darius and Autumn are going to be passing around something that we call a zuko ire. So let me just grab it real quick and just have a little conversation about it. Some of you have seen this before, but I'll give a little bit of history. So the zuko ire it's essentially a medicine pouch, and it can be made from a number of different woods. This one happens to be cherry wood, and it was worn on the belt, on the obi of the samurai throughout their entire history. And so what you will do when Darius and Autumn give this to you, one has a cap that has a string, and I don't lose it. The other one doesn't have a string. So whoever doesn't have the string, make sure that doesn't walk away. Okay, and what you will do is you'll take a little bit, put it on your hand just like this. It can be the size of a dime, a nickel, a quarter, etc. Rub your hands together, and then what you just did, or what you will do, is that you just killed 99.9% of bacteria on contact. And you're also going to regulate your system using fragrance. We'll talk more about this during the talk, but this is the first experience of fragrance, and so Darius and Autumn will begin to work the room to share that with you. What I'd like you to do throughout the entire process, with the zuko ire and with a number of other incense warmers that we're going to be passing around, they are the 21st century of something called a monkoro. Monkoro means incense listening vessel. The monkoro came out of the tea ceremony, and what you're going to get access to today is a 21st century version of it, which is pretty cool. It is hot in the middle. Don't touch it. Now, the minute I tell you don't something, you're going to want to do that. And then you'll have a burn, and then you'll be mad at me. So I've already covered it. Don't touch it. All right, awesome. So welcome to Altered States and Aromatic Minds, Psychedelics versus Psychotropics in Consciousness, Culture, and the Brain. My name is John Launius. I am the founder of Shihan Wellness. I am the Director of Community Outreach for the Special Operations Charity Network, and I'm also the Director of Strategic Operations at Lifetime Media. The reason why that I include all of my background is because with Shihan Wellness, this is where I'm primarily doing the work that you're going to get access to tonight to a certain extent. This is where I teach martial arts. This is where I do fragrance, and this is also where I do fragrance hypnosis and also conversational hypnosis. This is also where I do things like the personal incense journey, where you and I sit for an hour and a half. We'll talk a little bit about that. And this is also where my work crosses the work with veterans, active military, and first responders. The reason why this talk is so timed perfectly is obviously we're seeing what's happening with Ibogaine, and we're beginning to see other therapeutic psychedelic therapies that are beginning to either A, be approved, or B, beginning some major research. What we're going to cover tonight will become very important, not now, not tomorrow, but in about 2 to 5 years. So what you're getting a look at tonight is actually what's happening in Western medicine. I'll tell a quick story about this. I was in Newport Beach, California at the Village Tea Hut back in November. I spent a whole weekend doing Japanese traditional incense ceremonies and other ceremonies that I call the incense journey. The incense journey is the American version that people can sit through instead of you having to sit for 4.5 to 5 hours on your knees. Anybody want to do that? No. See, that's the reason. Carlene's like, yes, I want to, absolutely. Well, as I was getting on the plane to come back to St. Louis, not at the airport, not in the terminal, but in the jetway, meaning that there's no way I'm getting, back out at this point. And on the jetway, there was a big poster from UC San Diego that said, does smell have a cure for Alzheimer's? And the answer is yes, it absolutely does. So you're beginning to see smell therapies move into Western medicine that intuitively other cultures around the world have known for thousands of years. So hopefully that gives you enough of a baseline about where we're going to go. Any questions so far? Okay, here we go. So before language, before logic, before conscious analysis, there was scent. Long before human beings built laboratories, long before we mapped neurotransmitters, and long before we understood receptors and neuroplasticity, human beings were already altering consciousness with smoke, resin, root, flower, bark, and breath. A smell could signal danger, home, death, and yes, the divine. So tonight we're going to examine two fundamentally different pathways to altered experience. One destabilizes cortical hierarchy. The other defines limbic tone. Both affect consciousness, but not in the same way. And that distinction matters deeply if we are serious about neuroscience, mental health, contemplative practice, emotional regulation, and the future of consciousness research itself. Because modern culture increasingly speaks about altered states as though they are all versions of the same phenomenon. They are not. And most of you in the room already know that. Medicine is not psilocybin, or meditation is not psilocybin. Psilocybin is not ketamine. Ketamine is not sandalwood. Sandalwood is not alcohol. And incense is not something simply that, quote, smells good. Mechanism determines outcome. Tonight is about declaring, tonight is not about declaring one path superior to another. It is about precise understanding. It's about recognizing that disruption and regulation are profoundly different operations within the human nervous system. And perhaps most importantly, it's about understanding what modern human beings are seeking when they pursue altered states at any level. So let's frame the question. When discussing altered states, the modern conversation often collapses everything into a single spectrum. But mechanism determines outcome. Are we inducing cortical entropy? Are we modulating emotional regulation? Are we dissolving perceptual boundaries, or are we stabilizing attentional networks? These are all very different operations, and yet culturally, we often place them into one giant category called consciousness expansion. But neuroscience tells a more precise story. A person drinking whiskey by themselves at midnight is not experiencing the same mechanism as a monk practicing breath discipline. A person inhaling sandalwood during meditation is not undergoing the same process as someone ingesting psilocybin. Even if both later say, quote, that experience changed how I felt about myself and the world, end quote. One of the great problems in modern consciousness dialogue is conceptual flattening. We flatten vastly different neurobiological mechanisms into emotionally appealing language. And when we do that, we lose clarity. So here is the essence of our time together. Psychedelics and aromatic psychotropics represent two fundamentally divergent mechanisms for altering consciousness. One through destabilization, the other through regulation, each within unique experiential, clinical, and philosophical signatures. This distinction matters because it changes how we research these substances and how we apply them clinically, how we train practitioners and evaluate risk, and ultimately how we understand healing itself. Because one of the deepest questions underneath tonight's conversation is this: does transformation require disruption? Or can transformation emerge through coherence? Those questions sit beneath everything we will discuss tonight. So let's do some defining. We'll define psychedelics, even though most of you in the room I know can do it as well as me. But here we go. Classic psychedelics such as psilocybin, LSD, and DMT act primarily as 5-HT2A receptor agonists. Now, that sounds highly technical, so let's make it a little more human. These compounds strongly influence serotonin signaling in areas of the brain involved with perception, meaning-making, identity, and prediction. Because your brain is constantly predicting reality, let me say that again, constantly predicting reality, many people assume they passively observe the world. Neuroscience increasingly suggests something more complicated. The brain is actively constructing experience moment to moment. Psychedelics interfere with that predictive stability. They increase cortical entropy, reduce activity within the default mode network, and temporarily loosen hierarchical predictive processing. The result can be ego dissolution, perceptual distortion, synesthesia, non-ordinary cognition, mystical type experiences, profound shifts in self-boundary awareness. You may not know it, but I'm floating 2 inches off the floor right now. I'm kidding. Okay. Is he really? Is that what he's doing? No. So this is structural disruption. And I want to be very careful here. For many individuals, psychedelic experiences are among the most meaningful moments of their lives. That alone deserves respect. But meaningful does not automatically mean benign. A hurricane permanently changes a coastline. A forest fire changes an ecosystem. Controlled demolition changes architecture. Transformation and destabilization are often intertwined. One of the great misunderstandings about psychedelics is that people think they simply add hallucinations, end quote. What they often do instead is reduce the brain's normal filtering systems. Suddenly the mind becomes less certain about what reality is supposed to look like. Boundaries soften and categories blur. Time stretches. That sense of self can temporarily dissolve. For some people, this feels liberating. For others, it is downright terrifying. And for many, the experience is both. So let's define aromatic psychotropics. In contrast, aromatic psychotropic materials such as sandalwood and Borneo camphor, which you will have an experience of here momentarily, act through sensory modulation, not cortical destabilization. Psychotropic is a broad pharmacological term encompassing substances that affect mood, cognition, or mental state. But tonight we narrow the lens specifically toward plant-derived volatile aromatic compounds, sometimes also called volatile organic compounds, VOCs. So, some substances that interfere with the nervous system primarily through olfactory and transdermal pathways rather than systemic psychedelic disruption. And this distinction matters enormously. Why? Because smell is ancient. Would anyone like to guess how ancient it is?
It's the original sense.
It is, it absolutely is. Because remember, when we are smelling, what we are doing is we are sensing chemicals in the environment. And the mucus systems inside of our sinuses are a replacement for when earlier iterations of whatever we came from were in the water. So that is the reason why that we have that. Part of the reason why that dogs have a much better smell system than we do is not the fact that they have more receptors than we do, it's because they lick their nose. If you licked your nose, you would smell better. Please don't do that. I mean, if you want to, you can. That's totally up to you. It's just a little weird, okay? Suddenly by the way, the whole group, just kidding. So our sense of smell is ancient, very ancient. Your olfactory system is evolutionarily older than all of your higher cognitive machinery, all of it. Which means aroma reaches into the nervous system quite differently than language, visual information, and intellectual reasoning. Language is a technology. Do you know that? Language is a technology. If I don't know how to speak German, I don't understand that technology. If I don't know Japanese and someone's speaking to me in Japanese, That's like a different, computer language in computers. So it's a technology. It's a limiting technology, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely it is. Just get into an argument with somebody or try to explain something that you saw. It will never be the same as your direct experience. So, Santalum album, which is one of the things you're going to get to experience tonight, true sandalwood, has been used for thousands of years across contemplative traditions. Not because ancient people lacked sophistication, but because they understood state changes experientially. Temples did not accidentally smell the way they smelled. Incense was never merely decorative. If the 60s would have never happened, this talk would be very different. But most of my work, most of the time, is showing people what real incense is. And when they get an experience of it, they're like, this blew my mind. Because it is not the head shop and the truck stop incense with names like luck and money and joy. When you get access to it, it's a completely different experience. So we'll get into that. So incense was never merely decorative. It shaped emotional tone, attention, reverence, and regulated the nervous system. In many ways, incense represents one of humanity's early forms of environmental psychology. And we today, in the 21st century, experience it the same way our ancestors did as far back as 300,000 years ago, though that number keeps getting pushed back by archaeologists more and more every 3 to 5 years, because they continue to find more fossilized remains of what we are now. We are known as Homo sapiens sapiens. Most of the time it just gets shortened to Homo sapiens, but technically we are Homo sapiens sapiens. We are the wise, or the doubly wise humans. Now, if you watch the news, you'll have a different opinion about that. But what we are is that we are the doubly wise, bipedal, human beings. We today are atomically and neurologically the same as our ancestors from 300,000 years ago. All that has changed is our technology. I like to pause there because that's such an interesting to think that earlier our ancestors are the exact same way, physically and mentally, from 300,000 years ago. The only thing that's different is our technology, which I think is interesting. So, Tribalanops aromatica, Borneo camphor, is an example of a technology for our consciousness that has not changed during our existence as a species. This one incense was so valuable, it rivaled gold in certain trade systems. Think about that, right? If you are Christian in the room or you know the story of baby Jesus received frankincense, myrrh, and gold. The last part is still in contention, because if you go back and you look at the earlier iterations of the stories in different languages, frankincense and myrrh worth their weight in gold. Jesus may not have ever gotten gold, but we'll go with the story as it is because I'm not going to split hairs on that, right? But why would he receive aromatic material like that? Is it just for the smell? I mean, we can say in the Christian tradition that frankincense signifies that Jesus is the King of Kings. But if we go to Egypt, they'll tell you frankincense is the sweat of the gods. So just like anything, if you study it, you'll find all these different beliefs around certain things. But fundamentally, what we're talking about that has not changed for thousands of years is the medicinal reaction that our immune system makes to both of those fragrances. So we'll talk more about that. So aromatic materials crossed continents. They built economies. They influenced spiritual traditions, shaped ritual architecture. There is known by anthropologists as the incense cult, a total system of ritual devotion, ceremonial practice, or veneration around a deity, object, substance, or sacred act. The reverence of aromatic substances was not because they caused hallucinations, but because they altered human state. And significant to note, they did so without ego dissolution. These substances affect mood and cognitive tone without perceptual collapse. One pathway destabilizes identity. The other regulates the organism. So let's now talk about the mechanisms of psychedelics. Psychedelics amplify serotonin signaling, particularly again in the 5-HT2A receptor. Neuroimaging demonstrates increased global function connectivity and decreased modular organization. In simple terms, parts of the brain that do not normally communicate intensely suddenly begin exchanging information more freely. Anybody ever have that experience before? No one wants to raise their hand. Okay, moving on. So, I got nods, so we're fine. So but that process creates plasticity. It also creates unpredictability. Let's explore the 4 mechanisms of psychedelics. So our first mechanism one is the 5-HT2A receptor activation. Agonism at cortical serotonin receptors triggers downstream glutamate release, amplifying cortical excitability and cross-module processing. Say that fast 10 times. This is one reason people may hear colors and feel music. The boundaries between sensory systems become more permeable. Mechanism number 2, increased cortical entropy. Brain imaging reveals heightened signal complexity and reduced top-down constraint. Entropy sounds abstract, but think of it this way. Normally, the brain behaves like a highly disciplined orchestra. Psychedelics temporarily loosen the conductor. Suddenly, instruments begin improvising, sometimes beautifully and sometimes chaotically. Mechanism number 3, default mode network disruption. The default mode network, often associated with self-referential thought and narrative identity, undergoes acute desynchronization. This correlates strongly with ego dissolution. Your inner voice saying, "This is me. This is my story. This is where I end and the world begins," temporarily weakens. The only reason why you know who you are is because you remember what has happened to you before this moment. Without your memory, you would have no idea who you are. This is the reason why that Alzheimer's is terrifying for people when they confront it, because suddenly they don't know who they are anymore. Well, this is also the reason why, to a certain extent, why if you are ingesting certain psychedelics and you lose your perception of self, it can be darn right terrifying. We'll keep building on this. So for many individuals, this can, though, be spiritually profound. So we're balancing spiritually profound and terrifying. So mechanism number 4, acute neuroplastic window. Psychedelics may create transient periods of enhanced synaptic flexibility. This is why researchers are increasingly exploring therapeutic applications involving trauma, addiction, depression, and rigid cognitive patterns. So at the beginning, when I said this is a timely talk, when Mike and I, hatched this plan to be here tonight, none of what's happening at the level of the federal government was happening. I mean, there was talks, but now suddenly some of these therapies are being put into play, and that's really interesting because that's the first start of this. If we look at the legalization of cannabis, that we could argue started around 1993, primarily in Israel, as research began, you could see a path for the legalization coming at some point down the road. I was telling Mike that back in the 90s, when I owned one of the largest incense stores in the world, I was telling people that psychedelics and marijuana would be legal in our lifetime. And you can imagine the cross-eyed 3 looks that I was getting. But, that's where we were, and that's what I said, and I stand by it. All right. But plasticity is not automatically healing. Plasticity simply means the system becomes more changeable, and change can move in multiple directions depending on the context, which brings us to something critically important: set and setting. Ancient ceremonial cultures understood this deeply: the environment, the preparation, the guidance, and meaning. It all matters. Some of you in here are practitioners of different modalities, and you already understand the importance of set and setting. This will become more and more important as more and more people begin to understand this. But you have to understand the whole process behind it. So the molecule is not the entire experience. The context becomes an integral part of the pharmacology. So now let's talk about mechanisms of aromatic psychotropics. Aromatic psychotropics engage the nervous system through an entirely different entry point and cascade. Rather than disrupting cortical hierarchy, they modulate subcortical and autonomic systems, particularly the ancient olfactory-limbic circuitry that bypasses thalamic relay. Aren't these big sentences fun? Well, this distinction is profound because most sensory information in the body passes through the thalamus before broader cortical interpretation occurs. Notice I didn't say reality. I said interpretation. In other words, all other senses except our sense of smell pass through the thalamus. So, by that very nature alone, smell is different. Smell takes an ancient and fast shortcut to the brain, one deeply tied to survival. Smell is unfiltered. Said another way, you're seeing reality as reality when you are smelling, because you experience the fragrance before you have an opportunity to add any meaning to it. Are human beings meaning-making machines? We absolutely are. Just think about the text you got today. And you got a text from someone, oh, they must be mad. They didn't put a smiley face at the end of the message. You ever done that before? Make a meaning about a text? Okay, I'm getting a yes. Thank you. I appreciate that. Everybody's like, no, we won't admit to it. Okay? So, the creatures that stopped to intellectually analyze the smell of smoke near a wildfire did not survive long enough to pass on their genes. The creatures that immediately reacted to the scent of decay, predators, fire, or spoiled food survived and did pass on their genes, which means that the olfactory system evolved to alter our physiology rapidly, not eventually, but immediately. And this is one reason scent can feel emotionally powerful before we consciously understand why. You smell something and you suddenly feel uneasy, or safe, or nostalgic, or alert, or calm. Before thought arrives, our physiology begins changing. That's extraordinary. And frankly, most people underestimate how much smell shapes their emotional life every single day. So let's look at the mechanisms of aromatic psychotropics. The first one is olfactory-limbic pathways. Volatile molecules, in other words, molecules that are evaporating from something organic. There can be sometimes inorganic, but that's a different story altogether right now. Volatile molecules bind olfactory receptors, transmitting signals directly to the amygdala and hippocampus, a neural shortcut enabling rapid emotional and memory modulation. So let's make that human. I want you to think for a moment about the smell of an old church. Take a moment. Think about the smell of an old church. Then, perhaps an old library. Go there in your mind's eye. What about your grandparents' home? Or perhaps the smell inside of a hospital waiting room. What I'd like you to notice what just happened. You did not simply remember information. Your nervous system began reconstructing an emotional atmosphere. You didn't smell the smells. You saw the sights. Because here's what's also interesting. Nagarjuna, who was an ancient Indian/Buddhist saint, Hindu Buddhist, he said that we can use fragrance as a way to enlightenment because you have to be in the presence of it. You have to be in the presence of it to experience it. Another example is if I say, remember the smell of a pine tree, all that happened was you had an image of a pine tree. You cannot recreate it. Now, that does not mean that phantom smells will not appear to you. It just means that in this particular scenario, you have to be in the presence of a smell to experience the smell. That is the reason why it brings you to the moment. That is the reason why Nagarjuna said we can use it as a path to enlightenment. So, your nervous system began reconstructing the emotional atmosphere. This is not imagination alone. What's happening here is we're tapping into our neurobiology. The olfactory bulb projects directly into structured systems associated with emotional survival, memory, and associative meaning. There are a whole cadre of fragrances that if I were to put them in the room right now, you would have different emotional attentions to those. We won't go into all of those, but I recently had an experience where I stopped off to get food at a place, and for whatever reason, when I walked into the restroom to wash my hands, whatever the mold smell was, I immediately transported to my grandmother's house when I was about 8 or 9 years old, and I've never done this before. And that house has been torn down. Like, I mean, we're talking almost 40 years difference, but I was right back in it. The other story that I usually tell in the Incense journey experience is that my father was a hoarder, and it took a while to get to his bedroom when he passed away. But in his bedroom, in his closet, there was a shirt that was covered in plastic. And I mean, I remember, I'm like, oh man, I know what's going to happen when I open up that plastic. And sure enough, moved the plastic, and my father is right there back with me. It is amazing when you start to understand this, how you can actually not only control the reality of yourself, but the reality around you. I am not joking when I tell you that good questioners and interrogators in certain government agencies will pump fragrances through the ceiling, especially if I know the person's background. Where did you grow up? Go ahead.
I had this experience walking into the library today.
Ah, Mike, talk about it.
I didn't think about what it was, but I immediately, as I was coming up to the entrance, I went back to the zoo in Brooklyn when I was a little kid near the elephants, and I realized it was the smell of mulch. It's taking me right back, though. Which
Oh, yeah.
is, again, something I have not ever thought about in a long time.
Yeah, well, I have a very highly trained nose, and I wasn't ready for that smell. Like, you know, I saw Darius and Autumn. I'm like, oh, we're gonna talk. Boom! I got punched in the face, and I was like, oh, mulch. Hello. I see you, mulch. Okay. But I mean, that's a really powerful example. So, Mike, thank you for that. So, and you know, literally, my next line is, smell does not politely knock at the door of consciousness. Perfect share, Mike. Right. So it enters through the side door. And because this shifts, aroma can become an incredibly powerful regulatory tool. Yes, it can be transformational, but I'll be honest with you. You know, people come to my stuff and they're like, okay, yeah, that felt really great. But they don't have this life-shattering change. Sometimes they do. I'm not saying that's that completely. But it is a slower process. It is the equivalent in many ways, and this has been my experience. It may have been that for you as well. For some people who are heavy habitual users of psychedelics, it is a lot like we've taken a door and we've opened and closed it and slammed it so many times that the hinges become a little unhinged. You're all laughing because you know what I'm talking about, right? I'm not judging, I'm just telling you my experience, right? If you open and close and slam a door too many times, you become unhinged in many ways. Now, those doors of perception, and we've talked about that for a long time, maybe that's a good thing for you, maybe it's not. But the juxtaposition between the two states that we're talking about today is that this is a more gentle way to unlock the door and to go through. I've been doing incense since I was 9 years old. I don't need to knock through a door necessarily, right? So really the thesis of tonight is really about what's going to happen, and I have heard this more times than I can count in my healing work, is that, you know, veterans, for example, who want to, try something that gives them some relief, they might do psychedelics, but they don't have a support system following that. And then they go, well, I got to do some more of that. And then they feel even worse. So what this is about is regulation, ultimately, but we'll get into that. Okay, so now we're going to talk about mechanism 2, amygdala and hippocampal modulation. Aromatic compounds may downregulate the threats that we feel, processing, enhancing, moving through the hippocampal memory consolidation. Again, in simpler terms, certain aromas appear capable of reducing emotional alarm signaling while simultaneously influencing memory and emotional association. During the 20th century, Helen Keller wrote, "Smell is a potent wizard that transports you across thousands of miles and all the years that you have lived." So Mike, when you're talking about being transported back to Brooklyn, how old were you in Brooklyn at that time?
7.
You were 7 years old, right? right? And you're now 15, so there's only been a couple. He's a lot older than that. Okay. All right. But this is what Helen Keller was talking about, right? Now, whether you believe Helen Keller had the disabilities that she did, and there's some question about that in the 21st century, there is. But what she was primarily doing is using the senses available to her, right? And he was using this to really time travel. And so in many ways, when we are using fragrance, we are literally time traveling. We just saw this example. Now, if I told you you could travel into the future, would you believe me? Maybe we'll get to that. Maybe that's a talk for another day. All right, so because modern human beings are profoundly overstimulated, we have constant alerts and notifications to process. We have constant cortisol, constant vigilance. Is this true for all of you? Absolutely it is. My wife all the time, John, put your phone down. But put your phone down. But put your phone down. But put your phone down. You know, that's very real. Now, part of it is, yes, I'm checking work, and part of it is just like, you know, I enjoy scrolling. But we all know what we call scrolling now. Doom scrolling. Because it never ends. So, anyway. So most people are not merely tired mentally. They are physiologically dysregulated. Their nervous system rarely receives a true signal of safety. For those of you who have been to my incense journeys before, when someone experiences relaxation for the first time, what happens to them? Anyone know? They fall asleep, absolutely. And then they get self-conscious about it. Because when you start to understand relaxation, every night when you're approaching bed, when you relax, you go to sleep. But most people live, so there's a Japanese word called shikaku or taifune, which means eye of the hurricane. Most people live their life in the chaos of the hurricane. And the first time they get to the center calm, they're like, good night. But what would happen if you were able to be at the center calm of all of your chaos? Not that you're shirking it, not that you are avoiding it, but that you are in the middle of your hurricane. Well, when you get to the middle of the hurricane, the barometric pressure is pretty high, isn't it? So usually when I will usually use this example when I'm addressing business groups, when I'm talking about the use of management techniques to be able to step out of the chaos and step into the center calm. But when you do that, the barometric pressure, the pressure on you to be able to make things work becomes that much higher. When you're in the chaos, all you're doing is surviving. Different story altogether. So the nervous system, again, rarely receives a true signal of safety. And throughout history, aromatic traditions often functioned as environmental signals of transition. When incense was burned in the temple, the nervous system understood this. This space is different, you might say. When resins were burned in funeral rites, the nervous system understood that this moment matters. When sandalwood filled contemplative environments, attention itself changed. So not because someone intellectually decided to relax, but because physiology was influenced continuously. So what I'm going to ask you to do now, and we're leading up to something, so I just want you to take note. Where are you mentally? Where are you physically? Because in a minute, we're going to introduce some fragrances to you, right? And I want to see the difference. So you don't have to take copious notes about it. I just want you to be aware, where are you? You know, are you worried about the list of doing laundry or your homework or whatever it is you have after this, right? But where are you now mentally? Are you relaxed? Are you not relaxed? So just take note of that. I'm not going to give you any more suggestions because I don't want to put, words or thoughts into your minds. Okay. So let's look at mechanism number 3. So the GABAergic and parasympathetic effects. Compound-dependent activation in GABA pathways and vagal tone supports physiological calming, reduced heart rate variability disruption, and stress hormone attenuation. Again, let's put this in normal language. Your nervous system has accelerators and it has brakes. Modern life is very good at pressing our accelerators, right? You ever have that feeling where it's like, I'm gonna get everything done today. And then you get one thing done. Like, what happened to the day? What happened to the day? Right? Like, if I get 4 things done, I'm kind of happy. But my list continues to grow and grow and grow, just like everybody else's, right? So again, modern life is very good at pressing the accelerator. Aromatic regulation often helps engage the braking system, having your breathing slow. Muscular tension reduces, internal vigilance softens. And importantly, this occurs within perceptual destabilization. That distinction matters tremendously because not every nervous system needs disintegration. Some nervous systems need safety and they need grounding. Some need stability before insight is even possible. There are some individuals walking around today who do not need their sense of self shattered. They need their nervous system regulated. This is an important distinction in modern consciousness culture. Why? We are living in a world now where I can go to Mexico for 48 hours and come back and call myself a shaman.
Yeah.
That's dangerous, in my opinion, just my opinion. When I went through my formal training, I was not allowed to teach for 10 years. My teacher said that when you address people, you will be ready to address people. You know? Now, if you've ever seen the movie Men in Black, there's a very famous scene that takes place on the bench, right? You've got Tommy Lee Jones and you have Will Smith. And I'm not going to do the whole quote, but basically what happens is that Tommy Lee Jones turns to Will Smith and says, "A person is smart. People are dumb, panicky, dangerous animals, and you know it." So notice my teacher said you'll be dealing with people, not persons. Now, in my therapy work, in my therapeutic work, said another way, I deal with people, not persons. Sorry, I deal with persons, not people. There we go. I'll get it right. When I am dealing with the person, then we get very specific about what it is that you are dealing with, right? As a people, we are dealing with lots of things from a societal standpoint. As a person, you're dealing oftentimes with things that are completely different than that. And you're all having your own battle, like that one, Instagram meme will often say. Be kind, everyone's fighting a battle you don't know. But it's true. I am always stunned to learn about what people are carrying and holding. And all of us are, and all of us will until we shuffle off this mortal coil. Okay, so mechanism number 4, state modulation, not rupture. So these compounds reduce stress biomarkers such as cortical, cortisol, while refining effective states. Notice the language here. Refinement, not rupture. Modulation, not collapse. This is perceptual disintegration. This is not perceptual disintegration. This is nervous system tuning. And humanity has intuitively understood this for thousands of years. Ancient cultures did not possess fMRI machines. Well, maybe the ancient Egyptians did, but we just haven't rediscovered that yet. We'll go talk to Graham Hancock, okay? But they absolutely understood state change. Temples smelled different than marketplaces. Meditation halls smelled different than battlefields. Sacred space often involved intentional atmospheric engineering. Incense was architecture for attention. I'll tell you this quick story. So I will oftentimes work with veterans who have a lot of PTSD and TBI. And they will come at me through, someone recommended them. And there was a veteran that I have worked with who, has seen some stuff. Soft operator, right? And at the beginning of our session, she said, "Look, I'm here because I was recommended to you by a high-ranking officer in the military. And what I think you do is," and I said, "Okay, great, good to meet you, here we go." By session number 3, he was like, "I apologize." Because again, if all you know is head shop incense and truck stop incense, and suddenly I'm showing you something the right way, warmed the proper temperature, I'm telling you it is transformational. Who in the room has been to an incense journey or a person thing with me? A couple people. Has it been transformational? Yeah. Like there's a huge shift, right? Now, I don't know what that shift is for you, but it's completely different. And people are like, you know, I had a participant at a retreat that I did last weekend, and she goes, "This happens just by smelling." And I said, "Yes, it does. Good job. Tomorrow we're going to learn letters and numbers." I did not say that. I did not say it. I wanted to say it, but I didn't say it. Okay. By the way, as a komoto, we make a promise to do what we do with great joy. So please understand that what I'm doing, I'm honoring our tradition by doing it with great joy. Okay. So I'm not in any way, shape, or form discounting anyone's experience. Again, we just do it from great joy. Okay. So incense was architecture for attention. It shaped the mind through the environment itself. So before I talk about sandalwood and Borneo camphor, both fragrances have been, or they're about to move about the room. So let's talk about this. Can you bring, that's here, I'll just do it. I'll be right back. Okay. Darius and Autumn, they each have one of these, and they have one of these. Let me explain. This is Borneo camphor. It has been sold on the open market for 900 years. It comes from the island of Borneo. When you go and get Borneo camphor, only indigenous people are allowed to go and collect it. There are lots of magical rituals along with this. Do not get offended if I say the word magic. Magic has always been just about transformation of consciousness, and depending on the culture, it exists in all of that. It's the way that we transform consciousness by connecting to nature. There's a lot more to this. All right. What you will do is that you will open it up, and you will take at least 3 sniffs. As much as I want to tell you what you're supposed to experience, I'm not going to do that. The reason I used to do that because I felt like I always needed to let people know I know before they knew. and I went to, the first year I was at HypnoThoughts Live, which is the largest hypnosis conference in the world that I present at. I was doing this, and finally one of the attendees, she goes, "John, you know how you're letting us know what we're going to experience before we experience it?" I said, "Uh-huh." She goes, "You realize we're all hypnotists, right?" And I said, "Yeah." She goes, "The power of suggestion?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, great." So I don't do that anymore, okay? So you're going to feel something. Okay? Or not, right? Or not. No, you will. All right. Make sure please make sure the lid is back on it, and then pass it on to the next person, okay? So we'll start that as I'm talking about the next thing. And if I was allowed to, I would have done some other types of things in the room, but I'm going to honor the majority of the rules here. The majority. Okay. This is the 21st version of the ancient monkoro. The monkoro is the incense listening vessel. On one of my trifolds over there, you'll see mine, which is a very old one, and it is central to our work in traditional incense ceremonies. What happens is that we put a number of bamboo ash into the monkoro itself, and then we turn it into a mountain using the hyosei, and then we drop kodadan into it, and then you put the ginyu on top. Did you all follow that? Mm-hmm. So you don't need to worry about that today, okay?
A lot of words.
Yeah, a lot of words. A lot of Japanese words, right? All right, so anyway, what will happen is that Darius and Autumn will pass this around. There will be a light on the front. Don't worry about it. But again, this is hot, okay? So please don't touch it. I know you're going to want to. I know. Anyway, on here is a little piece of sandalwood, santalum album, okay? And then what you will do is you will cover your hand. You will breathe out. Inhale only with your nose. Turn, blow, and do that a minimum of 3 times. Minimum of 3, no more than 5, okay? So I'll go ahead and turn this one on. Dozel. Thank you. It's going to take about a minute for that to get warm. Okay, I'll grab the other one. All right, so I'm going to wait just a couple of more moments. So who has experienced the Borneo camphor first so far? What do you notice about that? What do you notice about it? By the way, there is no wrong answer.
Refreshing.
You what?
Refreshing.
Refreshing. Okay, I heard refreshing. Anybody else?
I felt a clean and calm sensation.
Good. A clean and calm sensation. Okay, good. I'm so tempted to tell you what it all is, but I'm going to be quiet. What else do you notice about the Borneo camphor, the first one?
A little energizing.
Energizing. Great. Remember that one. Good. What else? Anybody else?
I thought it smelled like, I had renal failure as a kid. It smelled like undergoing dialysis.
So it smelled like what?
Undergoing dialysis.
Undergoing dialysis. Okay. Got it.
Don't mean to be offensive.
Something what?
I don't mean to be offensive if that's offensive.
No, not at all. No. And remember that so terpenes control the color, taste, and smell of everything in nature. They also tell our immune system what to do and what not to do. There are lots and lots of volatile chemicals in Western medicine, so it will not be uncommon for you to cross-associate a fragrance with different things that are there. If that is a negative thing for you, then we would avoid that fragrance, right? And so what we're beginning to do in our interaction is normally I will give my clients, especially when I'm doing fragrance hypnosis, is that I will give them this document called the Natural Preference Survey document. What this document does is that it helps me dial you in regarding fragrance. You are more than welcome to take this. You are more than welcome to integrate it into your practice if you so desire. Here is my request though, that if you use my documents, leave my logo on it, you can add yours, okay? Please do not be like someone who came to 6 of my incense journeys and then one day invented something with a very similar name. Because that's IP, and then my attorney's like, what should we do? And I go, I'll talk to him. And guess what? We're friends now. So, because I'm also a 3rd degree black belt in Aikido, which means the way of harmonizing energy. So I will blend energy. You thought I was going to go someplace else with that, didn't you? Okay. Who else would like to share their experience with Borneo camphor, the first one? Yes?
It made me think of cleaning.
Yeah, made you think of cleaning products. Yep, common answer. I'll tell you why here in a minute.
So, forest.
Anybody else? Forest, yeah, good. Okay, would anyone like to guess maybe some of the terpenes that are in Borneo camphor? A pinene, forest. The Chinese call it brain of the dragon. So when you talk about invigorating, the Chinese used to call it brain of the dragon. I can show you numerous Tang Dynasty poems written where, in the hour of the horse, I found myself tired. I then got aloes and brain of the dragon and was refreshed. And this is the poem I offer you. By the way, I used to work in radio, so I do lots of voices. So you're like, what's he going to do next? Today I did my landman impression, but that's a different story. Okay, moving on. Does anyone notice that their sinuses or their lungs are open more after Borneo camphor? Did anyone notice that? Yeah. Okay. You're also getting it at a very, very subtle level. If I was able to have a warmer in here and I was able to give you the off-gassing, not the smoke, it seems like smoke, it's not, is that what these are is that these are sinus and bronchial dilators. They open up your system. We are a bunch of tubes. Human beings are a bunch of tubes. We really are. Our digestion system, you know, all of our veins and all of this, right? And so part of what keeps us healthy throughout life is that we keep those tubes clear. All of them, right? You have no idea how much mucus and phlegm is in your body. You have no idea how much toxins are in your body, right? I got ill coming back from Vegas 2 months ago, and I still have stuff literally coming. I'm fine, I'm healthy, but my body is like, okay, we're gonna take a minute to get this out of your head, right? Now the incense is helping, but again, I'm not slamming doors here, right? But this is a way to give your inner body a cleansing experience. Not an accident when people talk about purifying yourself through fragrance, through smoke, that has been written about for thousands of years. There's a lot more to this, and we're starting to get a little bit outside the scope of the talk, but I want you to know that there's a lot to this. As I often tell Darius and Autumn, it's not what I'm gonna say, it's what I'm not gonna say in a talk like this, right? So, all right, so what about the sandalwood? Thoughts on the sandalwood?
So calming, warm.
Calming, warm. What else?
Made me think of leather.
You what?
Made me think of leather.
Leather.
Yeah.
Yeah, not uncommon, not uncommon. Good, what else?
It wanted me to go within.
Yeah.
I wanted it to stay with me. I wanted to be
Yeah.
in that space.
You're like, don't take it away, come with me.
Yes.
Yeah, good. So Sandalwood album, okay? Anybody else want to share before I tell you a little bit about it?
It was soothing.
You what?
Soothing.
Soothing, it absolutely is soothing, yeah. So let me start by saying this. Whenever anyone wants to work with me and they're describing their inability to access their emotions, the first fragrance I will choose is sandalwood. After I give them access to Borneo camphor. Some of you in the room have worked with me at the level of hypnosis and fragrance hypnosis. And you know that when you come into the office, the first thing that I do is I throw some Borneo camphor on and you're like, oh, it smells good. And yes, it does, but what I've done is I've cleared your brain. I'm opening up your system so that the other molecules that we're going to experience over the next hour and a half to 2 hours get where they need to get to in your body, essentially, okay? Sandalwood, known as the great receiver in the Hindu tradition, has a lot of connotations with water. There's a Japanese expression, mizu no kokoro, mind like water, mind like water. What happens to water when it sits?
Stagnates.
Yeah, it starts to stagnate and then has disease. Same thing with us. You know, if we didn't move around at night when we sleep, we would end up with bed sores. If for those of you who are in the medical community, one of the big things you do with your patients is you move them if they can't move themselves, because if you don't do that, then you will start to get lesions and sores, right? So there's also a connotation with grounding. I'm not going to get so much into chakras tonight. I'm going to, like when I start getting into that, for those that haven't studied it or they're coming at this from a very pragmatic scientific standpoint, it sounds like I'm getting into the woo-woo. Some of you heard me say this before. When someone says, oh, John, you're into incense, you must be a woo-woo person. Yes, I am. And that is a veiled insult when they call me that. My job is to take you from the woo-woo to the wow-wow. Because when you have that experience of the aha, of the cooling, of the calm, I'm feeling better, I'm feeling less, all these thoughts that I'm having, they suddenly, wow, that's really what it's about. So for 35 years since I started saying that, I literally take people from the woo-woo to the wow-wow. I will let people get in my face, and they don't do it so much anymore, but I remember in the 90s talking about yoga and having, you're the devil, it must be Satan. No, it's exercise and movement. Sure, could we extrapolate this all out and could we get into the magical side of yoga? Absolutely, but very few people in the West follow that. Not saying they don't. But the point is that I will suffer your ignorance long enough to enlighten you. And that is not a flex.
Thank you for your service.
Carlene said thank you for your service, right? But it really is that. It really is that. Think about how many times you reject people who understand something more than you do. You reject it for whatever reason, and then when it finally gets integrated in you, you have that aha moment and your whole world changes. The way of the healer, the way of the true healer is not easy. It is not easy at all. If you have healed yourself, you are an avatar. You are, a deity among humans, right? That's not the exact quote of an avatar, but you get what I'm saying. it's God among men, but I didn't want to genderize it. But anyway, the point is this, is that there are, I always think it's funny, the people that are yelling at me the loudest are the ones who need it the most. And that's usually my indicator. You know, I think what you do is blah, blah, blah. Okay, great, just come on. Here we go. Anybody else about sandalwood or aloes, sandalwood or Borneo camphor in your experience?
The Borneo, almost, I felt like as I smelled it, it changed. I felt like different, you just kept smelling almost different things.
Yeah, yeah. It's a very complex fragrance, especially in the mode that I'm giving it to you. But for example, if anyone wants to attend the next presentation of the Incense Journey, which will be on Sunday at Home Healing Center, we actually spend 2 hours going through 8 different fragrances. And we leave each one in 15-minute increments. And the first one I always do is Borneo camphor. And I do it the way that I want to do it, not the light, easy way that I'm giving it to you right now. Like, you'll know it's in the room, right? And you're like, oh, okay, I can breathe again. This is amazing, right? And that's the experience. So not uncommon right now that you're like, it's a complex fragrance. When I'm doing it the way I should be doing it, it's not complex. I mean, it's complex, but it's very much like in your face and everything opens up the way it's supposed to. Because again, my job is to prepare your body for the other molecules that you'll be experiencing that take you on the journey itself. And you'll find that it is relaxing, it is centering, it is calming, and is unlike anything else you've ever experienced. And I'll tell one story to illustrate this, and then I'll move on. There was a woman a couple of years ago at HypnoThoughts Live in Vegas, and she came completely out of the blue, not a hello, not a whatever, and she was like, "You're the incense man." And I said, "Yes, ma'am, I am. How are you?" She's like, "Well, I'm an aromatherapist, and so we do the same thing, so I'm not coming to your talk." Good to meet you. And I said, "Okay, you're an aromatherapist. That's great." I said, "Do you only use essential oils?" "Yes, I only use essential oils." I said, "Great. You and I do not do the same thing." "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well," I said, "when you're using essential oils, is the entire spectrum of the molecules contained within the essential oils?" "No, that is correct. What I do is all natural fragrance, original raw materials, that is the entire spectrum of the chemicals." And she said, I'm really not clear. I said, "Okay, well, in the 90s, when the internet was first, getting to the public, even though the government had it 20 years before that, they were having problems sending music over the internet. So they invented 2 different protocols. We had MP3s and we have WAV files. WAV files are all of the information about the music, all of it. And an MP3 is a shorter version of that. If you are an audiophile, you can hear the difference. If you are not, it's fine, it's good enough. I am a WAV file. She is an MP3. And she goes, "All right, I'm coming to your talk." With that look of let's find out. Afterwards, she was like, "Oh my gosh, you're right, we don't do the same thing." And I'm like, "Oh, we are, you're right, we don't." Anyway, she's become a huge advocate for what I do. And I tell her all the time. I said, "I tell the story all the time about you." She's like, "Please don't ever say my name. I was kind of a jerk." And I was like, "That's okay. I'm used to it." So, all right. So, sandalwood's primary active components include alpha-santinol and beta-santinol, 2 terpenes. By the way, terpenes control the color, taste, and smell of everything in nature. And they tell our immune system what to do and what not to do. And there are only about 60,000 terpenes in the natural world. I will now name each one individually. A-santinol, beta-santinol, I'm kidding. I'm not going to do all 60. Okay, I'm not going to do 6, right? But when you begin to understand the terpenoid profile, it tells you what it's going to do to you for the most part. The outlier is your background of trauma and your background of experience and your culture. Just keep that in mind. Okay, so inhalation stimulates the olfactory bulb as you just did, projecting into the amygdala and the hippocampus, two components of the very, very complex limbic system. They're usually, when people talk about the limbic system, they usually talk about the big four components. There are a lot more to it. But anyway, studies suggest reduced anxiety and parasympathetic activation effects. Did you find that true of both sandalwood and Borneo camphor? Yeah, you had reduced anxiety, I mean, you got relaxed, right? You had different experiences, though your thoughts might have started to slow a little bit. That's important. So rather than increasing neural entropy, sandalwood appears to promote emotional stabilization and reduce sympathetic arousal. This is regulatory modulation, not cortical rupture. And historically, this is exactly how sandalwood was used. Not recreationally, ritually, meditatively, contemplatively. For thousands of years, across India and broader Asia, sandalwood became associated with prayer, stillness, sacredness, and attentional refinement. Over time, the scent itself becomes psychologically conditioned to calm. So here's the other part. Even though some of you described it as calming, if you don't have that association with it, I can actually create that in you by creating the set and setting related to calmness. Therefore, we can create a psychological anchoring around that. Again, that could be a talk in and of itself. But I just want to seed a couple of things with all of you that you can use this in ways that you're not even thinking of yet. So this raises the fascinating question. How much of consciousness is chemistry and how much of it is association? The answer is likely both. So Borneo camphor, on the other hand, Borneo camphor contains borneol and related terpenoid compounds. Borneol has been studied for neuromodulatory effects, including facilitation of GABAergic transmission and possible blood-brain barrier permeability modulation. In other words, it's been used to clear the mind, sharpen awareness, and bring attentional clarity. Did you find that to be true? Yeah. In other words, probably one of the most important things you can do for your mind is to slow your thoughts. Thoughts, especially chaotic thoughts, are a lot like that hurricane on your beach. You're ripping it up. Your ability to control your thoughts is your ability to control your reality around you. And this is where we really begin to get into more of the esoteric. The powers of mind. Who here knows what siddhis are? Okay, siddhis are powers of mind. One of them is psychic ability. All of this is related, and also, unfortunately, outside the scope of this talk. But he and I have been having a conversation the entire time without saying a word. Apple. Okay, moving on. So thinking about clearing the mind, sharpening awareness, and promoting intentional clarity, that language is fascinating because it notice the difference culturally. Psychedelics are often described as expanding consciousness. Borneo camphor was historically described as clarifying consciousness, not distorting sensory perception, but refining it. That distinction matters philosophically. One pathway says, hey, let's break the structure. The other one says, no, let's stabilize the structure until clarity emerges. There are some people who don't want to sit for 20 years in meditation. I have a solution for that. But in both of these cases, they alter consciousness. They do so through profoundly different biological strategies. I do want to tell a quick story when I talk about, I'm not joking when I say that you don't have to sit for 20 years in meditation to achieve a full state of no thought. There is an incense called Chiara, and I just bought a half a gram. How much does a half a gram of this stuff cost me? Anyone know?
Thousands.
Well, luckily not thousands. I mean, it will be soon, right? So there was a sale. A half a gram, which is, by the way, half of a paperclip, cost me $660. Yes, but it produces, my wife's like, yes, I know it costs me that. And I get it, and I'm like, look, honey, and you're like, great. It looks like little pieces of wood. And they are little pieces of wood. But a single inhalation produces the mental clarity of a 30-minute meditation in a single inhalation. I worked with a guy who had been a transcendental meditator for 20 years, who traveled all the way down from Iowa to work with me. And he was like, I heard about it. I don't know what's going to work, but here we go. And when we got to the end of the session, he was like, and by the way, I'm not promising what will happen to you if you ever do this, but he was like, John, that was amazing. And all of a sudden butterflies came on the outside of the window. And he was like, John, I've been doing this for 20 years and I'm not having the experience that I'm having. And I said, well, that's the value and benefit of an experience like this, is that if you've never gone up the mountain before and you've never made a path up the mountain, the minute you go up the mountain, then you can go back up the mountain that much easier. That's the whole point of this incense. I mean, there's a lot more to it. But the point is that what would your life be like if you had little to no thought for 30 minutes? Some of you in the room have experienced it. For some people, it's downright like, wow, it's quiet, right? It's like that experience about living in the loudest part of the city and then being transported immediately to the largest national forest with nobody around. And you're like, well, I don't hear anything. Or you'll hear a bird off in the distance. That's powerful. And that is the reason that when you read the ancient texts about this, that's where this is from. That's the reason why it works that way. All right. So let's talk about route of entry. We'll talk about brain access. So how a substance reaches the brain profoundly shapes the nature, intensity, and duration of its conscious altering effects. Psychedelics and aromatic psychotropics diverge at this most fundamental level. So psychedelics are systemic. They enter circulation, they cross the blood-brain barrier, and they alter receptor activity across broad cortical networks. The experience becomes immersive, global, often overwhelming. Aromatic psychotropics, though, are different. They are inhaled. Volatile molecules enter through respiration and olfactory reception. Olfactory neurons project directly to limbic structures, bypassing traditional thalamic gating. That phrase, again, sounds technical, but the implications are very human. Vision requires interpretation. Language requires interpretation. Smell is faster. You can consciously disagree with words. It is harder to consciously interrupt scent-triggered physiology. You smell smoke, your body reacts. You smell decay, your body reacts. You smell something entirely emotionally meaningful from childhood, and your entire nervous system can shift before conscious thought catches up. This is one reason scent-linked memory is often so emotionally overwhelming. When I work with veterans, there are usually three things that I'm aware of: the smell of diesel, the smell of burning hair, and the smell of anything dealing with medical supplies. That is the recurring motif. If they're coming to me with a TBI or PTSD, those are the smells that they will associate, because those are most of the smells associated with modern warfare. Now, here's another piece of my background I don't often talk about. I'm an explosives expert. And so when I used to work for who I used to work for, there was a fun little game we used to play when I was at Dulles. I would actually go up against the dogs that were being trained to smell explosives. I was 98% right. And these instructors were like, who's with us? You know? And so the other part about this is that if you're a breacher or were a breacher or you're around explosives, the shock wave alone causes scarring on the brain. But if you've never been around pentaethyl tetranitrate, trinitotoluene, cyclotrimethylene trinitramine, these high explosives that are detonating at 20 to 26,000 feet per second, they move through your body in a way that is very difficult to understand, and it locks trauma in. So when I'm working with somebody with that extreme of experience, I have to be extremely careful of how and what I do to let the unfolding occur. Because unfortunately, and we know this number, 22 a day, if you do not get the kind of healing that you need, the first step is that you will cause injury to yourself, then you will cause injury to yourself or others around you, and then you'll find yourself at the bottom of every bottle or other types of drugs that are available to you. And then if that doesn't get you where you need to go, unfortunately, you will find yourself at the end of the line. I don't need to tell you what that is. It moves me when I get to work with people that are willing to admit that they need help. And you might think, well, John, isn't that weird? You're just smelling stuff. No, they're not. There is a lot more to this world that is fascinating to me. And I found a profound joy in having people get recentered again, even just a little bit out of that hurricane, a little bit. Okay, so people hear an old song and they remember. People smell an old smell and they relive. That's the difference. And that difference matters. And in many, many ways, the access point shapes the experience itself. Psychedelics often alter the architecture of cognition from top to down. Aromatic psychotropics often alter emotional tone from the bottom up. One globally destabilizes the networks. The other subtly recalibrates physiology. One can feel like being struck by lightning in certain psychedelic experiences. The other can feel like finally hearing silence after years of noise. So let's talk about the experience profile comparison. Psychedelics, visual alteration, time distortion, ego dissolution, mystical intensity. Aromatic psychotropics, grounding presence, emotional steadiness, enhanced attentional clarity, subtle cognitive sharpening. Again, one disrupts predictive coding, the other refines baseline tone. And I want to emphasize something important here. Modern culture often glorifies intensity. Are you grinding it, man? Are you grinding? Yeah, I grind every day for about 17 hours. Back off. Intensity, though, can be confused with depth. In our culture, usually the loudest gets the most attention. My job as a Colmolto is to be common and rugged as stone. But intensity and healing are not synonymous. A thunderstorm is intense. So is panic. So is trauma. Intensity alone tells us very little about wisdom. Sometimes transformation arrives explosively. And sometimes transformation arrives quietly, through regulation, through steadiness, through finally feeling safe enough inside your own body to think clearly. Thinking clearly is a joy that not a lot of people have. Just drive on 270 in the morning. So, what I'm saying may sound dramatic, but for many people it is revolutionary, because many individuals today are living in a state of chronic sympathetic activation. Their nervous systems are perpetually braced, always anticipating, always scanning, always preparing, and under those conditions, subtle regulation can feel profound. A person does not always need to transcend reality. Sometimes they just need to return to it. So let's talk a little bit about cultural lineage. Psychedelics possess long ethnogenic traditions within Mesoamerican and Amazonian ceremonial contexts. They were not casual recreational systems. They were often highly ritualized, structured, guided, symbolic, communal. Preparation mattered, meaning mattered, integration mattered. Modern culture sometimes extracts the molecule while discarding the container that historically surrounded it. And historically, that container mattered tremendously. Some of you have seen me in Western clothes like I'm wearing now. Some of you have seen me in a traditional kimono. Others of you have seen me in other things like my dogu and other outfits that I wear. All of that is intentional because it creates a different energy every time I do that. I made the choice today to dress as what you might consider to be the nicest in the Western culture. But I could have very easily done this in a t-shirt, but it would have been different. It would have been different. I would have said the same words, but your perception would have been different. So let's contrast this with aromatic traditions. Sandalwood has existed at the center of contemplative ritual for over 2,000 years, probably much older. Agarwood, known as black gold, became one of the most treasured aromatic substances in human history. That is that $660 little pieces of wood that I just bought, right? Frankincense moved through temples, trade routes, coronations, funerary rites, and sacred ceremonies. Egyptian kaifi, and from the Egyptian kapet, was burned in ritual environments designed to calm and prepare consciousness in the evening. In Japanese kodo, the way of incense, which is my formal training since childhood. In kodo, participants do not merely smell fragrances. I've told you to smell tonight, but what you've actually been doing is listening. We listen to it. Molten coal. So think about how extraordinary that language is. Not smelling, but listening. Because the experience is attentional, it's meditative, it's refining. The goal is not sensory overload, it is perceptual refinement. Ancient civilizations understood something modern society often forgets. Environment shapes consciousness. All I got to do is look in your car or look in your house, and I'll give you a pretty good idea where your mind is. And we all have that one room, don't we? We all do. So light, sound, architecture, ritual, and aroma all shape consciousness. We talk about consciousness, but do we know what it is? We have no idea what it is. We're getting a pretty good idea. Right now, the prevailing thing is that we download our consciousness. From where? Who knows? But that's where we are currently. So, smoke. Let's talk a little bit about smoke. Smoke occupies a mysterious place throughout human spiritual history. It rises, it transforms, and it disappears. When I was at the retreat last weekend, I juxtaposed smokeless incense with a smoking incense experience so that I could teach people the meditative process of watching the smoke move. There is a piece of our brain that needs to see water. And if you understand Hermetic philosophy, one of the dictions of Hermetic philosophy is as above, so below. In the same way that the tree at the top will look very similar to the roots at the bottom. Well, here we have an incense burner of earth, right? You have things that you're burning, the smoke is rising up. Well, what about water on the way down? So this lends itself naturally to understanding the four directions, all the different aspects of nature, which you can then start to understand why there's always been a magical tradition associated with this. Again, outside the scope of what we're talking about, but my teacher was very smart. My teacher said, you will understand all of the religions and all of the cultures, at least as it pertains to incense, so that you're able to offer something to everybody. And your job is not to judge them. Hence the quote some of you heard me say before, thus the master is available to all people and doesn't reject anyone. This is called embodying the light. What is a good man but a bad man's teacher? What is a bad man but a good man's job? If you don't understand this, you'll get lost. However intelligent you are, it is the great secret. Notice that I genderized it for me because that's how I identify. And that is a quote from the Chinese that's almost 3,000 years old. In the Chinese language, you do not make a distinction between male and female. We are all essentially the masters, so therefore, if you find that quote or want to use that quote, make it work for you. That's one of the reasons why I love the Chinese language, is because it doesn't make a distinction of gender. That's really interesting to me. Okay, so across cultures, incense became associated with transitions between the worlds, usually visually through the smoke. So life and death, ordinary and sacred, body and spirit, chaos and stillness. From the Japanese, we say tenshin, tenshin, heaven and earth. We are the embodiment of heaven and earth. We are connected to the heavens and we are living physically with the molecules of this reality. Now I sound like a mystic, right? Not intentionally, but what I'm telling you is true, right? These are substances of refinement, not rupture. So let's talk about the clinical landscape. Modern psychedelic research increasingly explores depression, PTSD, addiction, existential distress, end-of-life anxiety, and some of the results are remarkable, but excitement should never outrun rigor. Some individuals experience profound healing, others experience destabilization. Biology matters, trauma history matters, environment matters, psychological structure matters, preparation matters, integration matters. One of the great dangers of consciousness work is confusing revelation with resolution. An experience may feel profound but still remain psychologically unresolved. That distinction matters clinically. Now contrast that with aromatic psychotropics. Sandalwood demonstrates real calming effects. You told me that. Borneo camphor derivatives have been explored for neuroprotective and cognitive enhancing properties in preclinical models. And importantly, these compounds may offer scalable, low-risk regulation tools. Not every intervention must be dramatic to be meaningful. Sometimes the future of mental health may involve learning how to regulate the nervous system and more consistently and more gently over time. And frankly, modern society desperately needs better regulation technologies, because many people today are not suffering from a lack of information, they are suffering from nervous system exhaustion. And in that context, regulation itself becomes revolutionary. So intensity versus stability. Psychedelics create transient destabilization that may open windows for reorganization. Sandalwood and Borneo camphor primarily regulate stress circuitry and emotional tone, potentially improving baseline coherence rather than disintegrating structure. Again, one dismantles, the other one stabilizes. And I want to pause here because modern culture often romanticizes intensity. Intensity becomes confused with truth. Intensity becomes confused with healing. Intensity becomes confused with awakening. But intensity alone tells us very little about wisdom. A panic attack is intense. War is intense. Trauma is intense. Intensity is not automatically transformation. Now, to be clear, profound transformation can absolutely emerge from destabilization. History is filled with moments where human beings changed radically after their existing structures collapsed. A near-death experience. That happens, whole new thing happening for that person. A spiritual crisis. How many have I had? I can't even count, right? A major loss. How many major losses have we had that changes our world overnight? A revelation, a psychedelic experience. Sometimes the old architecture must crack before something new can emerge. But that is not the only way. That's not the only pathway to transformation. Sometimes healing arrives quietly. Sometimes healing is breathing deeply for the first time in years, sleeping peacefully, just literally all of this, putting this together. The point is that there's a change in our perception. We are quite literally expanding our experience, one somewhat outward and one somewhat inward. So perhaps the most illuminating distinction between the two modalities lies in the modes of neural change. Psychedelics and aromatic psychotropics do not merely differ in degree of effect, they differ in kind. Each offers a fundamentally different theory of how consciousness shifts and how lasting change can be achieved. Psychedelics as the reset model. Transient cortical disintegration. Acute dissolution of rigid neural patterns, especially in the default mode network. This creates a window of reorganization. It's a window of reorganization. What about the other model? We're talking about aromatic psychotropics as the refinement model. This gives you a way to soothe your dysregulated system. Breath by breath, ritual by ritual, association by association, and not because of extract memory. This gives you the ability to very safely and calmly regulate your system. You can use this fragrance system following a psychedelic experience to support instead of going, I don't know what's going to happen next. You can use it in lots of different ways because those fragrances are going to store the atmosphere. And it's not magic. But it literally, your system learns through this over and over. You can teach it safety and stillness and focus and presence. So destabilize and then begin to modulate in a very healthy way. There are people that absolutely would value and benefit from a psychedelic experience. If the hardwiring of your brain has become so difficult to shift in any other way, then you may need to do that. But what happens afterwards? Again, this is the whole thesis of this. How do these two work together? So we're now moving into risk and intensity. So psychedelics require psychological screening, integration support, and careful set and setting. Aromatic psychotropics are lower in intensity. Quality sourcing matters. Psychedelics are powerful. So biology matters, the psychological structure matters, preparation, guidance, ritual structure, everything we've already covered, all becomes very, very important. So we can get our system to stop scanning, to stop consuming, to stop reacting. Let it break on one level, but then let it get to the state of calmness and modulation. This is the value and benefit. This is what I'm talking about Western medicine. So some of the psychological distinctions, again, psychedelics can break the structure. And then Sandalwood can steady the self. That's a very easy way to put this together. So instead of, faster, louder, and more shocking, well, let's go for slower and quieter and more refined and more attentive. If you are used to chaos, though, will you enjoy the fragrant path? You will not. And that's okay. And that's okay. When I teach martial arts, especially Aikido, Aikido is such a simple art to learn that it's hard for people to learn it. It's so simple to learn that it's hard to learn. So, one requires restoration, others bring expansion, some bring grounding. But we need to understand timing, dosage, context, biology, intention, and human readiness in both psychedelics and in psychotropics. Both are important. I pointed that out with Borneo camphor. I'm only able to give you a sliver, like 1% of the full experience of that. But if you come to, my talk on Sunday, you'll get them all very intensely, but not over intense. So conclusions, we must resist collapsing all altered states into one conceptual category. Disruption and regulation are not the same. Entry and coherence are not the same. Hallucination and modulation are not the same. Sandalwood and Borneo camphor represent ancient regulatory technologies. They do not shatter perception, they strengthen it. So we need to know when to dismantle. We need to know when to stabilize, when to soften, when to challenge the mind. So for thousands of years, humanity searched for transcendence in roots, resins, smoke, mushrooms, flowers, ritual, prayer, and silence. And beneath all of it may exist the same fundamental longing to suffer less, to perceive more, to feel connected, to feel whole, to feel even briefly that the separation between ourselves and life is not as absolute as we once believed. The future of consciousness research lies not only in the molecules that dissolve the self, but also in the fragrances that steady it. Thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you.